Hello, everybody, and thank you for checking out my channel, The Phenomenological Thomist. Today, we're going to be discussing the first way with Jonathan Stute, as well as discussing some of the differences in the approach to the first way via existential and Aristotelian Thomism. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you, or I'd like you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was born in the year 1225, the year of our Lord, in Sicily, in a little town called Roccasecca. Okay, as you've guessed, I'm Thomas Aquinas. I am. And you call yourself the Phenomenological Thomist?
I do.
Thomist?
I do.
You are. Well, you're phenomenal. This is true. But I myself, I'm the Existential Thomist because I happen to, after surveying a number of the various schools which have come up in my name, I've come to determine that the existentialist school is the one that is not only most accurate in terms of its representation of my own views, but also has developed nicely on them, and it's the attractive and beautiful Thomism. Hence, Existential Thomism is the way to go.
Yeah.
Following after Etienne Gilson and Joseph Owens and all those folks. But no, in reality, I am, as you said, John Stute. In case people haven't been able to tell, I am not Thomas Aquinas. Although Thomas Aquinas did come up to refute a heretic last year at some point. I think there were some disputed notions on act and potency in the first way, and so it's ironic that over a year later, we are yet again returning with Thomas Aquinas speaking on the first way with another heretic.
Yeah. Oh, with another heretic. Ouch. Oh, gosh.
Wait. Oh, I'm sorry. What is the point of this? I misread your name. Anyway, so my name's John Stute. I'm gonna take this stuff off because it feels too awkward and cheesy.
No worries.
And I feel a little bit
uncomfortable. Bust out of your costume. Yeah.
In any case, my name's John Stute, and I am a professor of philosophy at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut. And my background in Thomism is I have a master's degree in theology from the Augustine Institute, which I actually focused mostly on biblical studies there. And I also did some research I did some work on natural theology and discipleship ministry, and worked a few years as a youth minister. And that's actually really where my love of Thomism and philosophy in general came up, or was kindled, because most of the kids that I was meeting, what they needed to know, what they were asking about, what was really burning in their hearts, was more about how do I know that God exists? How do I know that there's such a thing as right and wrong? How can I live a good moral life? What does it mean to be? These existential questions, or what you call the preambles of the faith. And what the religious ed curriculum was giving them, I mean, it's all great stuff. But it was like, does a kid who's struggling with the question of gay marriage and atheism and the problem of evil really need to know the three offices of Christ? No, we're not there yet. All that stuff is wonderful and beautiful, but, this kid is hemorrhaging out, spiritually speaking. He doesn't even have the basic components of faith, or things that are necessary for the faith. So let's address those things first. And so my interest in philosophy came into play in my experience working in ministry, or practically working in ministry. And my area of expertise, or the thing that I study the most, I guess, is actually going to be in natural theology, and metaphysics as well. So my background in Thomism is mostly first starts in theology, but then I actually just completed my master's degree in philosophy at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. I defended my thesis about 3 weeks ago now. I passed with highest honors, so hooray!
Yeah.
Yay! Which is great. And for me, that's actually a big personal goal, or something that was very fulfilling, because I actually barely graduated high school. I have ADHD, and I couldn't medicate it when I was younger for a number of reasons, and I had a very difficult time with school. I did great with tests. I was in the top 1% for my for the state standardized testing. I passed everything that I took at school, but I just never did my homework because I was lazy. or rather, I just was unmotivated. There's a big difference there. And so I had a teacher in ninth grade specifically say that I should never go to college, so the fact that I graduated with a 4.0 summa cum laude, with highest honors and all that kind of stuff from a master's program in philosophy is very gratifying for me.
Congratulations.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that, and it's also a good story. I guess I can tell my son later in life too, or my kids in general. I have two kids. I have one who's on the ground, my son, who's 4.5 years old, and his name's Michael, and he is an interesting kid. He had his first jiu-jitsu tournament not too long ago. I don't know if I ever told you this, but
I did,
and he won. I mean, of course, I'm going to brag about it because my son is amazing. Awesome. But anyway, so I have him. He's 4.5 years old, and my wife is pregnant right now. She's 5-6 months pregnant. I don't know. Wait, January, February, March, April. 4 months. 4 months pregnant.
Okay, still fairly early on. Good.
So fairly early on. I think her 20-week appointment is next, or in just a week or two here. Nice. Where she has to go do the ultrasound to check a whole bunch of stuff. In any case, so my background in theology and philosophy, both master's degrees. I actually don't have an undergraduate degree. I cheated and stole my way to graduate studies, which was actually it was fortunate insofar as I didn't have to go the route of what everybody else does, and spend a bunch of money or go into massive debt to get an undergraduate degree that I never really used. And so instead I jumped into 2 master's degrees, which are equally impractical. But that's only if you're looking at it to serve another end. I mean, studying theology and philosophy for their own sake is something that's of the highest value, really, because it engages the intellectual and moral virtues more than probably just about any other science or field of study, because you're studying the highest things. But both of them are master's degrees. I didn't do the undergrad. I got in through a special circumstance. So that was really nice, but it was difficult because I didn't learn how to write an academic paper until I was actually writing master's level papers, and so I just jumped right into graduate studies and having to learn Greek and doing these complicated commentaries and whatnot. So it was a very interesting experience to jump into the deep end of the pool without ever having learned how to swim in the first place.
That's fascinating. Wow, that's awesome that whether you were able to do that, to get into graduate school without having to go through the undergraduate program. I'm kind of frowning because I'm thinking about all the debt I'm in. I'm oppressed by my undergraduate debt. But yeah, no, that's awesome. And having 2 master's degrees, one in theology, one in philosophy, so that's awesome. What kind, in terms of Thomism, which philosophers most appeal to you?
Which philosophers most appeal to me?
Yeah, or you think are the best, I suppose. Actually.
Now, I think I'm the best. Okay, because Dan's first question is I actually really like Nietzsche, mostly because he's hilarious. I am dynamite. I am the Antichrist. He has all these amazing parables, and he's such a great writer. What I really like about him is he just is the consequence of modern philosophy. If you start denying things, if you start your philosophy out by first of all doubting the senses and doubting the ability of the intellect to actually grasp truth, and then somehow demanding that you have mathematical precision of everything that is in reality, and assuming that the world is divided in the same way that you divide your concepts, I think that you ultimately end up in Nietzsche. There's a number of reasons for that, but so I think Nietzsche is a great philosopher insofar. I mean, maybe not necessarily in his actual arguments, but insofar as he himself is the conclusion of what happens with the modern project.
Right. It's funny. I actually have a similar view with Heidegger. I think basically if I wasn't a Thomist, I would be a Heideggerian, just because I think that's the natural conclusion if you reject the Thomist principles. I think that's where you have to go, kind of.
Yeah, I would probably go more towards the continental route thing, mostly because one of the fundamental disagreements I have with analytic philosophy is that they always strive for clarity and precision, which is great. Do it. Define your terms. Argue well. Make sure you don't have any fallacies in your reasoning, etc., etc. These are all wonderful things, and a Thomist would affirm that those principles perfectly, and without hesitation. However, what I've found is that if you're going to be doing metaphysics, your metaphysics should match reality. So you can't do ontology. So ontology, I mean, okay, all right. I'm going to be using a distinction here that may not be universally accepted or recognized, but I distinguish between ontology and metaphysics in this way. Ontology is is kind of like the world aligning with your ideas, whereas metaphysics is your ideas aligning with the world. And it's not so much you're just asserting that things align in a certain way, but rather it's how you come to your conclusions. I think with a lot of analytic philosophy, you start thinking about how the world could be, and then you see if that's the way the world really is. Whereas the approach that Thomists have is that we start with the way the world really is, recognize that the world is scary and confusing, and then have a metaphysics which tries its best to really get its mind around that, but also to get the right terms and definitions in it, but also recognizing that there is a certain level of play or uncertainty that's simply going to come into the picture through the limitation of the human intellect and the different operations of the human intellect as well. What was I going to say about that? What was I saying? Oh yeah, analytic philosophy. So I'd actually probably skewed more towards the continental philosophy because at the very least they always start with experience. And yes, analytic philosophers do this too. But it seems a lot of analytic philosophy just like, they'll claim to do it. I mean, and that's one of the things I have to do is I don't want to speak against analytic philosophy because I don't actually know all that much about it, at least as much as I'd like to. And that's in fact going to be the project that I have over the next year here is learning more and more about analytic philosophy. In any case, long story short, I would probably lean more towards the phenomenology or existentialist camp or existentialist school of thought. But in terms of my favorite philosophers and the ones I think of that are the best, obviously St. Thomas Aquinas. I think Aristotle's an excellent philosopher. I actually think that Kant is an excellent philosopher too. I think he was wrong. He's a really unfortunate case of a good mind going the wrong direction, and then coming up with and basically destroying the world. I mean, he is called Matthew Kant, destroy your worlds, which is I think ultimately true in terms of how he makes philosophy, in particular metaphysics, very very difficult.
Oh yeah. Copenhagen revolution of philosophy.
Yeah, he had a Copernican revolution of philosophy.
Copernican, I don't know. I said Copenhagen. Copernican.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, Copenhagen was only after. It's okay, no big deal. He was still ahead of his time. That he shocking. But in any case, my favorite contemporary philosophers from the last 100 years or so have got to be Etienne Gilson, Joseph Owens, John Canassis, Cornelio Fabro. I mean, obviously Ed Fazer. Big fan of Norris Clark. John Whipple's pretty good too. I really like Gavin Curry, who's going to be coming on your show. And so he's got a. Never mind, I'm not gonna go that direction. And then I also really like a guy. I enjoy my thesis director, Dr. Robert Delfino. He's an excellent professor. He's a great mentor, good man, and a very clear thinker as well. And there is a Thomist who I think should be getting more recognition and more interviews and some more time in the spotlight. His name is Christopher Apodaca. I don't know if you
I know. I do know him. Yes.
Yeah. So he's some people know about him. They may know of him. He was a professor of philosophy at Holy Apostles for a good long time. But he's a really clear thinker. He's a kind man and just an overall great human being. He's been a mentor and kind of like a big philosophy brother of mine for quite a while.
I'll have to get him on the show. That's awesome. Yeah, I'll reach out to him.
You should. And he can talk about a whole huge range of topics.
Right. Whole range of topics. Definitely. Have you read any Martin? I'm terrible.
Martin.
Yeah, have you read any of him?
I have read Maritain. At Holy Apostles we have for a while we had a PhD program that was kind of a pioneer, not the word I'm looking for, pioneer, inaugural. Mm-hmm. Inaugural? Yeah, it was kind of its inaugural voyage. And they had a professor named Dr. John Hittinger, who previously taught at the Center for Thomistic Studies down in Houston, Texas. And he is a Maritain fanatic.
Awesome.
My gosh, and I read so much Marathon. This is probably the hardest class I ever took in my entire life. It was political philosophy, and prior to this course, I had never taken any political philosophy. It wasn't even interested in it. And suddenly, I jumped face first into PhD studies, and nearly killed myself writing the 28-page paper on defending human rights from a Thomistic perspective against who was it, Ralph McInerney and Alistair McIntyre, and I used mostly Marathon as my one of the philosophers on my side of the argument, saying that we do have natural rights, even pre-political natural rights.
Oh,
which are due to the sake being those who are created in the likeness of God.
That's awesome. I'm kind of more on the. It's funny. I almost everything else I would be on the Maritime side, but now on that I'm actually more McIntyre. But that's interesting. For just to kind of move into kind of the main topic, how would you approach explaining the argument to motion, assuming I didn't know anything about Thomism, especially given your background? How would you approach it?
How would you approach it? So, this is going to jump ahead a little bit. One of the things that I've noticed in teaching philosophy to people as young as 5th grade, and talking about Thomism, is that there's 3 levels, all of which have a different. How do I want to phrase this? All of which have a different certainty that comes about, or natural acceptance of the principles that St. Thomas's first way would offer. Right off the bat, I think beginners have a fairly easy time understanding what St. Thomas is saying, and have a fairly easy time of accepting it. And you can survive with that for quite a while. But once you start getting into these intermediate questions about active potency and some of the details regarding change and the various causal series of per accidens, per se, so on and so forth. Once you start getting into these more nitty-gritty details of the first way, I think things get a little more difficult, and your certainty about the conclusions of the 5 ways goes down a little bit. But then once you get through that, if you push through it and you are and you're diligent and you do your homework, you read your St. Thomas, and I don't just mean the neo-Thomistic commentators or the neo-Thomistic commentators like Ed Fazer or Rob Kuhn's, both of whom are just mind-bogglingly brilliant.
Just to touch on that, Michael Algross has a really good book like that called Who Designed the Designer, kind of a poor title for what it is, but it's actually a really excellent book about the first way. It's, at least for a beginner, for somebody who doesn't know much about it. But yeah.
Yeah, actually, that was a book that I read in my Philosophy of God and Nature course at the Existential Thomism with Dr. Christopher Bloom. Was that Michael Algross book, and I've always loved Michael Algross since then, and a few interactions I've had with him too. He's just a warm and genuine and an extraordinarily kind individual, very clear, has great examples and whatnot. I think I take a different approach to the 5 ways than he would. And what's interesting about that Who Designed the Designer book, he mostly follows the first way, but he sort of threads it together with the other 5 ways. So you have the first and second and third way treated in what's it, the 3rd chapter, and then the 4th chapter he starts talking about the degrees of being, which is the 4th way, but he connects it to the first way. And then there's a chapter that's called the Year of Whitaker's Daughter that starts going into talking about the 5th way. And so that book's excellent. It's very clear. I think that it has a lot of good principles in it, and it's easy for beginners to understand. If I were to recommend a book for beginners on St. Thomas's 5 ways, I would actually recommend my thesis director's book, Does God Exist?, which is a dialogue between an atheist and a Christian college student, and he co-wrote it with Matt Fratt. It's a really good book, and the reason why I like it is that it gets into, I think, some better details than Michael Algross's book, while still remaining clear, and he takes an existentialist approach to this way.
Right.
But getting back to your original question about how would I characterize the first way, the way that I would characterize it is I would first point out, if I were just talking to somebody, like you look around you, we see that things are in motion. So the very first thing that you do, and this is what St. Thomas does in all 5 of his ways, is he makes a note about something in sensible reality. He grounds himself in the world of our everyday experience. You don't need to get into quantum cosmology. You don't need to get into the crazy abstract math that you would for the contemporary design argument or some such thing. You don't need to start talking about possible worlds or whatever. You start in the world that's in front of you, the real world. And you notice that things are in motion, or that things change, and that whenever a thing changes, it goes from, kind of like one kind of existing in one kind of way to a new way of existing, even if it's slightly different. And that the way that this change works, if you're going to use Thomistic language, is that you see that there's a motion from potency, so what a thing could be, to act, to the way that it actually is. And now, when it comes to this argument of when it comes to the reality of change, what we find is like if you see today, my son and I built a fire together for the very first time to roast some hot dogs and some marshmallows. It was great. And when the wood is cold, the wood is actually cold. When the wood is on fire, it's actually on fire. But motion isn't either one of those two. Rather, it's the in-between. It's the igniting that we are looking at here. Why? So the question is, we have this motion that is existing in a subject. So a thing is in motion that is changing from a one way of existing to another way of existing. And what we find is that when we see something in the world, like the log heating up and accelerating, so to speak, towards being actually on fire, it's not something that the log can do in and of itself, but that's something that it has to receive from another. And so this reduction of potency, this what the log could be, or the way the log could exist, to the way that it is going to actually exist, requires something other than itself and outside of itself in order for it to come in, to exist in that particular manner, to be on fire. So we see this motion of from going from cold, from potentially hot to actually hot, and it's an in-between state that we're looking at. And we ask about why is it in motion, and we can say well, it's caused by something outside of it to be on the way towards this particular act, which would be on fire, which would be the log actually being on fire. And then we say, okay, well, it's caused by something else to be that way, or to moved by something else to be in motion or be on the way towards this new mode of existing. What we can ask then is, okay, well, whatever caused or puts that thing in motion, is that thing itself in motion? And if the answer is no, then we've arrived at something which is a first mover, which is not moved by any other, or we've come to something that is moved by another. And if it's moved by another, then we have to ask the question again: is it moved by another? And now, when we're talking about motion here, we're not talking about motion in terms of A to B to C to D in a linear sense, but rather what we're doing is we're actually looking at the motion of, why is this thing, this log being heated right here and right now, in this very moment. So we're actually more looking for is the ground, or the hierarchical series of why this motion is occurring in the first place, and why it can occur in the first place. And that kind of series is called a series per se, whereas the first kind of series, which is one that moves through time, is called a series per accidens, where it's more like one event follows another rather than one cause follows another, because on the Thomistic point of view, a cause, properly speaking, is one that is concurrent with its effect. And so the heating is concurrent with the agent which is giving the heat, and the patient which is receiving the heat. And I often liken this to a train, and this is a very common analogy. And when we see, if we were to look out into the world, we have a train that's right across the street from my house, and the train has these cars in it. You look at the cars, and they're in motion in one direction. And you see that the cars are in motion. And then you inspect the cars a little more and more, and you see that they're not the kind of thing that can give themselves motion, but rather they receive it from another. And they receive it from the one that's ahead of them, and that one receives it from the one that's ahead of them. Bucking it is going forever. It doesn't seem like that's the case. Could you? But why? Okay, let's think about it for a second. Let's say you got two trains, or you got two boxcars. You link them together. Is there motion? No, there's not going to be motion. Okay, let's say you add up 200. Okay, you got 200 boxcars. Link them together. Is there going to be motion? Can they give themselves motion? No. All right, how about 300 boxcars? 400, 500, 600, 6,000, a million, even an infinite number of boxcars which do not give themselves motion. Is that the sort of thing that can be the cause of the motion in the whole train? Well, no. The point here is you have to eventually come to something that is other than that which you're trying to explain, which are things that are movers.
Right.
So you come to an engine, or you come to some sort of rail that causes an electromagnetic pulse to push a train forward, or some such thing. In either case, when we look at the real world, we see that there is a series of act and potency, or there's a series of potency being reduced to actuality by something else already in act. And if it's the case that the thing which is the mover of the initial thing that we're looking at is itself moved, which it would mean that itself is being reduced from potency to act. And now, could this sort of thing go on forever? Well, in the same way, we couldn't have an infinite series of trains or boxcars which would be able to impart motion into themselves simply by the fact that they are an infinite series of trains or an infinite series of boxcars, but we must come to an engine which has motion in itself. So too, we would have to come to a first cause that has actuality within itself but doesn't receive that actuality from any other. And this is what we would call God, and therefore God exists. And there's some ways to break this apart.
Right.
Go ahead.
And on a point of that, right? Any hierarchically ordered series of causes or causes per se, wouldn't that lead back to God? Even if there was one example, only one example of it actually being that kind of series, it would only need one to lead back to God.
I'm sorry, what was the last part?
So what I'm basically saying is that all hierarchically ordered series of causes lead back to God eventually.
That I would say that's true. Yeah.
So you only need one example. Anything would work.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, anything would work, and that's one of the things that makes I think St. Thomas's argument is a little bit different than many other arguments. Is that St. Thomas's arguments it can work with your left shoe, it can work with your hand, it can work with the rock that fell to the ground the other day, it can work with the Earth going around the sun. It doesn't need the cosmos to be coming into existence at some finite time in the past or some such thing, in the cosmological argument, or the Kalam cosmological argument. Sorry,
right. Which is a common
all
misunderstanding.
Just like one thing.
Right. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I did interrupt.
Oh no, that's about it. And so I mean, if I were just to formalize it real quick, I have three parts though in terms of how I would formulate the first way, which is we see that things are in motion, but motion or change is reduction of potency to act, and anything that reduces from potency to act cannot be the thing which reduces itself from potency to act, because then it would have to be an act and impotency at the same time in the same way, which is impossible. And so anything that's changing cannot change itself. But if it's changing, and we as metaphysicians are looking for the causes of things, then there has to be some sort of something that's external to the thing itself that causes it to come into existence, or that causes the new mode of being to be real, to be realized. Mm-hmm. And so whatever this thing is, itself is either caused by another, or is itself completely uncaused, or completely, or is completely actual. If the first, then we can ask the question of we can show the question of infinite regress, and infinite regress in a series of per se ordered series is impossible. But if we come to the first, that is something that is purely actual, then we've come to God. And I have reasons for that last part, but we're going to talk about that in a minute.
Definitely, and that's important. One of the here I don't know if I want to touch on this first. I think so, just because I think it's important. Often you will get skeptical laymen, mostly, that say, okay, so what? That we've got this unmoved mover. So so what? Basically, they say, why should I believe that that's God, or why should I, take that kind of conclusion seriously?
So we're going to be jumping ahead here a little bit.
We can come back to that later if you want.
Is that fine? Yeah.
We can come back to that.
I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, either way. I mean, we can come back to that later. We can talk about Aristotelian and existential approaches to the argument for motion first, if that's better.
It's going to fit right into it, I think, actually.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's do that first then. So in what different ways would you say that Aristotelian Thomists approach the argument for motion versus, the way you would approach it, or the way existential Thomists approach it? And why do you think that maybe your way would be better to approach it, or is more correct, I guess I should say?
So I think one of the problems with there's the Aristotelian approach, as far as I understand it, begins with looking at the first way as more or less the exact argument that Aristotle gives in the physics or in metaphysics. And while that's true in terms of its formal structure, I don't think it's true in terms of the matter of the argument, what the meaning of the terms that St. Thomas is using. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that, and actually with the science within which you find Aquinas' arguments versus the science within which you find Aristotle's arguments. Aristotle's arguments for the existence of a first mover are actually arguments that you find in natural philosophy rather than metaphysics, which is why you find it at the end of physics for Aristotle, and it's it's the last part. I think it's book 8. It's the last part of the physics, and it's proving the first principle of why things are in motion at all, so on and so forth. Which is, it's a great argument. It's very interesting, but the reality of it is that with the argument from physics, what's interesting is you come to the conclusion and you find that Aristotle actually says that there are 47 or 53 such first movers, and so you have these 53 first movers with one primary mover, which is ultimately the sun, and these first movers they govern different things about the world, down here below, and they're the souls of the celestial spheres up in the heavens above, and so you get some, I think, problems with this, insofar as you can't get to the same God, and this actually relates to what we're going to be talking about in a minute here with the existentialist approach. You don't get to one God. You don't get to a God which is all-powerful, all-knowing, infinite in its perfections, and so on and so forth. In fact, Aristotle's God is one that is completely aloof. He doesn't care about the world down here below. He doesn't care about us at all. He only thinks about himself. He is the thought thinking itself for all eternity, and there's no real connection between the first mover and us, except that we are the effects of the first mover's actions. And so there's some difficulties, I think, with the Aristotelian approach. And one of the problems, I think, actually relates to one of the objections that we arrive at within the skeptical community against the first way, which would be the argument from, or the objection from existential inertia, mm-hmm. or the inertial, even if you just keep it in the realm of physics. I think that there is a reality, and I think J.H. Sobel brings this up really nicely in his book, The Logic of Theism, I think it's called, where he says, where he argues that if you look at the way you see a lot of Aristotelians argue for the first way, they will say things like, I am in motion, or I exist only right now because of the temperature of the Earth. The temperature of the Earth only has the quality it has because of the conditions of the atmosphere. The conditions of the atmosphere depend upon the distance of the Earth from the sun, and so on and so forth. And if anything in this chain, all the way back to the distance of the Earth from the sun, were to change or stop or cease, then I would cease to exist. Well, yes, there's some truth to that. if the sun suddenly went out, we wouldn't be alive much longer.
Right.
Because, of course, gravity might affect us much more quickly than the light would, but it's going to still take a few minutes for the light to get to the Earth and to cease heating the Earth and to cool down the atmosphere to the point where we can no longer, sustain our existence or sustain our organic functions. And so, even though I do rely on all these things in the physical realm for my existence, they're not something that is the immediate cause of my existence. They're rather the cause of my existence in some sort of formal sense or some sort of secondary sense. Mm-hmm. And so there's always this time delay or this gap between physical causes. So even ones that seem more immediate.
And this is you would distinguish between the efficient and formal cause here, I imagine. Like you're talking about efficient causes are what have that time delay.
In terms of physical things, probably, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Just making sure, just making clarification on that.
Right, and so because within there's always going to be that notion of time, because within motion is a measurement of change, and change in the physical world happens over time. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like there might be this time delay, and there's not going to be that your ability to make a connection to a real per se causal series, which is required for, or at least seems to be required for the mechanics of the first way.
Right.
And so this is just a rudimentary sketch of, maybe a criticism of the Aristotelian approach through the science of physics or natural philosophy. It's not necessarily a knockdown argument. But with the Aristotelian approach, I think that you only arrive at at best a first mover, which is based on, if you take Aristotle's word, is just one of 53 or 47 first movers, all of which are not the uttermost actuality in themselves. They're just purely act. They're kind of like what St. Thomas would call angels. And they're not going to be anything close to the God of Christian theism, which I think that St. Thomas's arguments actually get us to. But so the Aristotelian arguments the Aristotelian arguments for God's existence begin in the science of natural philosophy, but the arguments for God in St. Thomas's philosophy, and he's very clear about this, are actually found in metaphysics. And metaphysics has a different formal object than natural philosophy. Natural philosophy has the formal object of things in motion, and it's going to be things in formal motion. So that's going to deal with change insofar as it pertains to form and matter. And when it comes to the actuality in an Aristotelian argument for God's existence, it's going to be an argument through form subsisting in some prime matter, or new accidental determination of a substance to have a certain kind of form or another. But within the existentialist point of view, what we have is we begin not in natural philosophy with form and matter, all those things are considered in metaphysics, but they're considered in light of things which habenes esse, or things which have the act of existence. Right. And what we look at in natural philosophy are things insofar as they're form and matter. What we look at in metaphysics is the same things, but with a particular perspective of looking at their existence. And what the existentialist does is he recognizes that, and I think St. Thomas does the same thing, he recognizes that the act of existence is something that's presupposed by all other actualities. If you do not exist, there is no other perfection that you have, period. And if it's the case that you don't have any other perfections, well, then you don't exist. And there's all these formal and essential perfections that you may otherwise have, well, whatever. If you don't exist, you don't have it. And so esse is the actuality of all actualities. And when you reflect on the act of existence itself, the very notion of existence, rather than being the emptiest notion, it actually is the broadest, or that's actually the deepest notion. To exist, what does that mean? Well, it means in a way everything, You can think of in every perfection, again, perfection of being presupposes it. Existence within itself, if you were to consider it sort of like a super genus, which I'm not going to say that, but just kind of a loosely speaking, a super genus, it contains all the principles of life, intelligence, of power, of goodness. All these different perfections of being are found within existence in and of itself. And so if we're looking at, and so in that way, existence is an act which is considered precisely in itself. Now, this is only in our kind of our understanding of the term and understanding of that principle of existence. The existence in itself is something that's totally and utterly unlimited. Whenever we find it limited in some fashion, then it happens to be the case that whatever that the thing that we find that has limited existence is itself composed somehow. And the reason for this is that whatever limits another thing is something other than that which it limits. So let me give you a quick analogy here. So you have a big broad field, and in the field, you don't say, if you have a neighbor, like, hey, this is my field over here, so I'm going to add more field to my field to show you that this is my field and not your field. Rather, what you do is you set up stones, you dig a fence, you dig a ditch, you do something other than field to this to the field in order to limit it to a particular, a block of, this is where my yard is. Similarly, existence in itself is utterly expansive in terms of its extension and really deep in terms of its intention. So how much meaning it has infinite meaning. And if we're going to find something that limits existence, then it has to be something other than existence. And well, what is there other than existence? Well, nothingness.
Yeah.
And this nothingness, or this mitigated nothingness, is what we can say is kind of like a limit to the existence of the particular things in front of us. So we find that the things of our experience, because they have a limited range of things that they can do, a limited range of the way it can actually go about existing, that in itself, precisely in itself, apart from its existence, is nothing. Okay, but that there also must be another principle present within the existent, the thing in front of us, that is other than its own existence, which would be its essence. So the what it is. The what it is tells us the kinds of existing that this go about doing. When we get to this distinction, or this principle of limitation on existence, which we have said, it's this limitation towards existing in only one particular manner. So existing in a doggy way, existing in a human way, existing in a rock way, existing in a tree way. This principle of limitation is what we call essence. And so we have a distinction between essence and a thing's essence and a thing's existence. And again, because the essence in and of itself is something that is posterior to act, or posterior to esse, or its existence, we see an act potency relationship between the two, where the essence receives existence, or receives actualization, or is actualized by its esse, or by its act of existence. And this is sort of like, if we dive back to our natural philosophy for a moment, sort of like the relationship between form and matter. Now, in hylomorphic composites, that is things that are composed of form and matter, the form and the matter don't exist separately from each other as two distinct two different things. You don't have a tree form over here and tree matter over here, and you mush them together to become like the tree. Rather, the tree form, the form is the actualization of the tree, but it's distinct from the matter of the tree insofar as the full operation, the unity of the tree isn't something that's like a particular material thing within it, but it's the actualization of the matter to make it precisely this tree. rather than a boat, because then the form of boat would be in the wood, or the form of ash would be in the carbon in the tree, or whatever it might be. And so the form actuates the matter in natural philosophy, and so in metaphysics, when we consider the act of existing, the essay actuates the essence. And now in St. Thomas, and this is something that Aristotle was a little unclear about. For Aristotle, sometimes he said that essence is the form alone. Other times he said that essence is the form and the matter, generally speaking. But St. Thomas was much clearer on this. For him, essence isn't just a form alone. That's the form. That's something completely different. Essence, rather, is the form plus a general consideration of the matter. So it's the whole thing, the whole subject of essay. So it's going to be the form and the matter. And there's a particular order that an order of act potency that happens within the essence. So within the essence of a hylomorphic thing, you have the form, which actuates the matter. But because the form and the matter do not include existence in their very definition or their very nature, that principle isn't found either in the form or the matter. So it's explained by another principle, which would be the act of existence. And the act of existence actuates the matter through the form by actuating the form. And so there's a hierarchy right there: the essay, the form, and the matter. And it's all happening within the being, the real existing thing in front of you. And we often divide these things. We have to think in terms that are like they use our imagination to some extent, or an image. So anybody who's listening to this, just throw away your image thinking. You got to turn that off, and you really have to abstract here from the way that we see things in the world. Because these are principles in things, not things in themselves that are existing in things. So you have the form, or you have the matter, which is actualized by the form, and the form, which is actualized by the essay. But the essay is the act of both the form and the matter, but it actualizes the matter through the mediation of the form. And so the essay is limited by the form, and the form is limited by the matter. So there's this kind of like narrowing of actuality, of reality here, when you're talking about from essay to form to matter. So you have existence itself, existence limited as human, but then you have human existence limited to Paul or James or Sterling or John, and that's going to be the principle of individuation within the realm of substances. It's going to be the matter. So matter concretizes the form to make it a thing. Some one individual thing. And when it comes to motion, there's yet another act potency relationship here. Because anything in motion, or any motion that you find, presupposes a subject of motion. So you don't find walking in the world. It just doesn't like float out there somewhere in the void. Rather, what you have is a human walking, or a dog walking,
right?
Or children interrupting an interview. I mean, it still requires some existing subject. And motion is actually a category of accident, and accidents depend necessarily upon their substances, and especially no matter what happens to be, you won't find red out there. You won't find motion. It depends on something existing prior to it. And so what St. Thomas is pointing out in the first way is he's looking at there's motion in the world. And now motion, it really exists, because what he's doing here now is he's saying motion really exists. And now he's reflecting, wow, this thing exists in front of me. Let's reflect on that notion of existence. Existence is the act of all acts. Wow, this motion has existence. It has the act of all acts. But does it have it through itself? No, it doesn't. Accidents have to subsist in something. And then he turns his attention to the substance. Wow, the substance it doesn't have existence in itself either. And it's not and it isn't its own existence, because we can find it come and go. It can gain new existence. It can lose a particular way of existence, and so its existence is really unstable, and it's continually growing, or it has to be perfected in some way, which is why it's in motion in the first place, or it's losing some sort of existence through diminution. So it loses. Somebody gets cancer, or their body starts failing to digest food. They're going to lose weight, so they're getting smaller, they're getting weaker, but it's still a motion of some sort. But it's a loss of perfection of the thing in front of us. Or on the other end, somebody could exercise well and they could eat well, and then their body grows in perfection. Either way, whether it's through growth or diminution, there is some sort of new existing happening within the subject or within the substance. But since the substance itself, the man, doesn't include existence as one of his essential properties, this essential property must be added to it by something else. And whatever adds existence to the substance must either has existence added to it, which would be a cause per aliud, or it would be a cause per se, so one that gives existence simpliciter.
Yeah. Now,
if it's the first, so if it's an accident or a mover through another, or a cause through another, then we go through the infinite regress question. And now here we actually do have a very clear, or a very solid per se causal series going on. Because if you look at an accident depends at every moment for its existence upon its subject. And if the subject ceases to exist, then the accident ceases to exist precisely as the accident. And now, in the same way, if you look at the substance itself, you have the matter. So you have the matter of Paul, of John, or my dog. And if the form there stops actualizing the matter, then the whole substance ceases to exist.
Right.
Right. And so it's instantaneous. There isn't any break here. I mean, there's no time delay. Once the form stops actualizing the matter, there is no longer the substance. It ceases to exist.
Right.
Similarly, since the form is only the principle of existence in a mediated sense, when you find the essay of the thing, if the essay ceases to actualize the form, then it follows of necessity that the form can no longer give particular existence to the matter that it itself is actuating. And so if the essay is removed, then the whole chain collapses from accident all the way down to from accident to substance. Mm-hmm. And so there's this instantaneous dependency, or this per se causality,
right, of the accidents on their substance, which
the accident on their substance,
right,
and then which leaves the substance on its essay, and then the essay is causing it by another.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost an it's an argument almost from substantial change, right? For the ability of things to substantially change without being annihilating all their accidents. Because all the accidents would disappear.
Substantially change or accidentally change?
Well, substantially change, right? Because the per se would require that substantial change, right? Like the change from, I guess any change would work, but like as long as the substance was changed fundamentally, right? Or the substance. So
as long as it's changed somehow. I mean, yeah. Accidents always alter the substance, or always alter the subject. And so you're tracing one principle here. You're tracing the principle of essay from the accident all the way to the essay of the substance. And since the substance cannot be the cause of its own essay, because the substance itself, considered precisely in itself, is nothing, like we talked about before, because it's a limitation on the way a thing can exist, or way existence can be found. Itself being nothing cannot give everything. It cannot give itself existence.
Right.
It cannot be the principle of its own being in reality. But rather you find that it has to be caused by something else. And this has to be at every moment, in all the time. In the same way that an accident is always dependent upon its substance. properly speaking. And so the accident is dependent upon the substance. The substance is continuously dependent on the essay, and the essay is something that's prior to the substance, the same way the substance is prior to the accident. Kind of see how there's that back and forth going there to help you kind of like think your way through that. And so in the same way, the accident. So my walking isn't the cause of my being a human.
Right.
My being a human is the cause of my walking, or is the source and principle of my walking. And so in the same way, my being a human is not the source of my existence, but rather my existence is the most fundamental principle of why I'm a human at all, and why you can find me being a human at all. Rather, well, being a human, emphasis on the being part of it, or existing as a human. So my act of existence is the most fundamental principle of who and what I am.
Right. From which all accidents flow.
Yeah, from which every other perfection flows. And now, and then when you come to the per se causal series, it's the exact same thing, because you'll find if it's like some sort of like super angel or whatever, or first mover of some sort, the first mover the mover of that gives me existence would either have to be caused to exist by something else, or it is the very source of existence itself. If it's the first, then we again have this chain of that we have a per se causal series, because we have the thing, its essence and its existence, and then because there's the distinction in between the two, and that the essence of the thing being the principle of limitation, therefore when considered precisely in itself is nothingness, can't actually give existence, and so it has to be added by another. And this is again obviously an instantaneous in a per se causal series that's going on here. And since we already shown that can't go on forever, which interestingly enough, Sobel actually agrees with in his book that if we can show that there is some sort of per se causal, some sort of per se series of dependence going on, then we do actually get to a first mover necessarily. And he sees I don't see a way around that. That's fine. But on the other hand, if we say that you're looking precisely at the essay, we don't actually need that whole infinite regress thing. That's superfluous. That's just an extra argument. But rather, we can just get right to a first cause of existence. And why is that? Well, whatever can. There's an axiom. Agere sequitur esse. So a thing acts. A thing's action follows upon its being. A thing's action follows upon its way of existing. And if there is something that is giving existence simpliciter to a thing, not just some sort of formal determination of existence like we would on the level of substance, then what's happening is it's a granting of existence, even the most finite, minuscule existence, from nothingness. And the gap between nothingness and existence is infinite. And in order to bridge that infinite gap between nothingness and existence, whatever would be giving that act would have to have that act in an unlimited sense, would have to have power in an unlimited sense. But if its power is unlimited, so too is its esse, so too is its act of existing. And so we come to a first mover whose essence is the unlimited act of existing, which would mean that there is no distinction, no principal limitation upon his essence, upon his existence. So he is pure existence itself, ipsum esse subsistens, or esse purus, if you want to do the Latin, which I'm not terribly good at. So, okay. And this is what we come to call God. And the reason why we can call this God, as opposed to some like celestial sphere, is that existence is the act of all acts and the perfection of all perfections. If a thing does not exist, doesn't have intelligence, it doesn't have strength, it doesn't have power, it doesn't have will, it doesn't have any of these other these perfections of being that we find around us, goodness or truth or whatever. And so, since it is the infinite act of existence in itself, subsisting in itself, then it possesses all of the perfections of being in an unlimited sense. And so we can say that not only is it existing, a necessary existent, not only is it something that is the first mover of all things, or the first cause of all things, but is itself uncaused or unmoved. We can also say that it is infinitely good, or that it is good essentially, or that it is truth essentially, or that it is beauty essentially. or that is oneness and unity and immutability, and essentially completely possesses itself. And so you actually very quickly get to all the divine attributes, not only the ones that follow upon like the transcendentals, goodness, truth, and whatnot, but also the other perfections of being, the unmixed perfections, I think James Anderson calls them, which would be notions that are not proper to all beings, but rather they're proper to they are truly perfections because they are some sort of increase in being, and somehow this would be like intelligence or will or love. So God would possess love to the highest degree, who possess will and intelligence to the maximal or not maximal, the infinite degree. God is completely knowing. He's completely powerful. He's infinitely loving and good and just and merciful. All these perfections of being, not only the transcendental perfections of being, but also the perfections of being we find in creatures, would subsist in God in an analogous sense to an infinite degree.
Awesome. That was a great presentation of the first way. One I haven't heard of that in that way. Very, very interesting.
Probably because I'm a stark raving lunatic, so.
You're a existential Thomist.
Existential Thomism, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome.
Yeah, and you go ahead.
Well, thank you for presenting that. That was great. And it helps answer some of the other questions I had in terms of, like, obviously, that avoids a lot of those common misunderstandings that you have with the first way. What do you think are those that are the most common to misunderstand that first way?
What are the most common things? Well, yeah.
Both on the layman level and then also on a philosophical level, I would say. Besides the ones you touched with the Aristotelian Thomists.
Well, I think that, interestingly enough, most of the misunderstandings, both on the lay level and on the scholarly level, are roughly the same. So that there's a beginning of time, or that they're just reformulations of like the Kalam cosmological argument, or that they rely on outdated Aristotelian physics, and that just isn't the case. I mean, it doesn't rely on celestial spheres. And in fact, St. Thomas even criticizes Aristotle and Plato for only getting to the idea of celestial spheres in, I think, question 44, the first part of the Summa. I forget which article 2 maybe. Rather than actually getting to a first cause of being. Or they'll say, like you said, this only gives us a vague and empty notion of what the first mover actually is. Maybe it's a particle. Well, especially with the existentialist point of view or existentialist interpretation, a particle isn't the fullness of the act of being in an infinite and unlimited manner, because the particle is not intelligent. The particle isn't good. The particle doesn't have will. The particle is limited in some sense. The Higgs boson particle only does Higgs boson particle things, and its existence and all of its operations are limited precisely to being a Higgs boson particle. Whereas the first mover that we get to in the Thomistic argument is one that is precisely the infinite fullness and depth of being and existence. I mean, in all the perfections that are included therein. And so I think that many of the common misunderstandings are similar to the scholarly misunderstandings. One thing I want to make note of, though, is that, I mentioned before, maybe it was off air, I have ADHD. One of the things about ADHD is not so much that I can't focus on anything, as I focus on too many things at once. And it's more like a management of exactly what I'm focusing on. And this probably came through the podcast so far. But in any case, the joke is, I think people have ADHD when it comes to the analogies that we'll use, like the train analogy we mentioned before. So, and I hear this almost every single time I talk about the first mover argument. Oh, you see, there's a train, there's a boxcar, it's being moved by another. This can't go on to infinity, etc., etc. We have to have an engine. Well, the engine requires coal, so can't be the first mover.
Are you a college freshman now? That's what you sound like.
No, I am my sassy 7th grade kid who was giving me grief at lunch like three years ago when I was working in the industry. But it's like, no, dude. You got to focus on exactly what we're talking about here. So St. Thomas is looking at the existence of things, and we're tracing that. And the analogy here is not all the different factors that go into it being a train. rather what we're looking at is we're looking at the factor of motion within the train. And so when we talk about the motion within the train, because our train is all existing things in our analogy here, the engine is going to be the first mover. And so you don't need to consider things like the laws of physics or somebody bringing coal to the car. I mean, it's that kind of stuff. It's the engine. That kind of stuff is just it's arguing against the analogy rather than the argument. All the metaphor, all the analogy is supposed to do is just kind of give you an approximation of what's going on metaphysically behind the scenes, because that kind of stuff is a lot harder to grasp. And so in terms of like common misunderstandings, yeah, it's just going to be the normal thing of thinking that St. Thomas requires that we need to argue for a beginning point in time when what he's more concerned about is like right here and right now. Why are things in motion? Really, why do things exist in motion? Why does motion exist? Well, it exists because of the substance, but the substance doesn't exist precisely in itself because it is a subject of motion. And if it's a subject of motion, that's a subject of gaining or losing some new mode of existing, which means it doesn't have existence in itself. And if that's the case, then we see that because its motion is limited to a particular range of motions, then it in itself, its nature is, or its essay is limited somehow. And so if existence is the act of all acts, and outside of existence there is nothing, then the thing that's in front of us precisely in itself is existentially neutral. It could either exist or it could not exist. And if that's the case, whatever is neutral to one of two contraries requires a cause for why it is found to be in the actualized contrary. And so if it's the case that this thing in front of us is existentially neutral, then we see here that it was caused to exist, or is being caused to exist by something else, to cause it to exist. And so I think but in any case, the common misunderstandings tend to be more or less the same,
right?
Between the scholars and the laymen.
Maybe that's kind of convenient, at least for apologetics work. That they're study the same literature then. Do you think there are any really good objections, or not even really good, but like powerful objections against the first way that are important to know and consider and be ready to respond to?
I think that one of the more difficult ones is infinite regress, and one argument that you'll see often, and this one's you always go back and forth with this one. Who was I listening to? I was listening to a debate between it wasn't Sobel.
Opie?
Shoot, who was it? No, it wasn't Opie. It wasn't Opie.
Mackie.
Anyway, so maybe it was Opie. No, Mackie died like 30 years ago.
I don't know. You could have been talking about Russell and Completon,
maybe.
and I was still going to guess them.
Right. Well, Russell brings up the same thing. He talks about like if even in a per se order causal series, if we can account for every single one of the things which are being caused to exist, or that are being caused to be in motion, or whatever, or what may be, then you are explaining the whole series because you've explained every member of the series. Or you have the other interpretation, which is or the other conclusion which I offered, which is that you have to come to a first mover. You have to determine it because otherwise you wouldn't explain the motion at all. And now this one can be really difficult for a number of reasons. One, because both seem to be relatively intuitive. Both seem like, yeah, that seems to make sense. If you look at the train, the boxcars. If each boxcar can't move itself, and if it's being moved by another, then yeah, it makes sense. We have to come to a train. We have to come to an engine. Or then on the other hand, you could say, well, maybe the train's been just going on forever, and the train engines don't really need an explanation, or the boxcars don't need an explanation for why they're in motion at all. Well, the problem with this is twofold. One, it misses the very question, or misses the very thing they're focusing on. We're not looking for why is this boxcar in motion, but it's more like, why is there motion at all? And just to say that it's just there isn't really an argument. Secondly, it's just an assertion, without a whole lot to back it up, substantiate it. And I'm speaking very quickly here. And then secondly, I think you actually, interestingly enough, a lot of cosmological arguments get accused of committing what's called the compositional fallacy, which is to say that if you have, one example would be like every brick in the wall is red, or every brick in the wall weighs 1 pound, therefore the whole wall weighs 1 pound. So there's a shift there. But I actually think that the argument here from I think Russell talks about this, which you hear the same one, but if you account for every member of the series, you explain the whole series, actually does commit the compositional fallacy, because you're moving from, I see every single one of the members in the series in motion and being moved by the one previous to it, therefore the whole motion of the series is explained.
Yeah.
That is an unjustified leap in logic. And so I think that's a problem right there. The other one is existential inertia objection, which is the idea that once something comes into existence, then it's going to remain in existence until it's destroyed, or until something tears apart the unity that's required to make it an existing thing. Similar to, if I throw a ball, the ball is going to be flying through the air until it runs into something else. Everything in motion remains in motion unless acted upon by an outside force, and everything at rest remains at rest, or tends to stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. So it's in a way an existential restatement of Newton's law of inertia, or one of his laws of inertia. Excuse me. But the issue with this is I don't think it's a fair transition from physics to metaphysics, for one, because with natural philosophy you're dealing with I'm gonna skip that part. The difficulty here is, now this is going to be a bit technical, so hold on to your seats.
Woo.
So,
need a cowboy hat. Right. Be ready.
Cowboy hat.
Yeah, yeehaw!
I get it. Okay, so existence is not something that just happens once. It's something that happens through time. It's something that's continual. I don't exist in a new way at every moment. Right. Or sorry, I don't have how do I want to phrase this? Existence isn't static.
Yeah.
I'm always in motion towards some other way of existing, whether it's existing over here, existing over here, existing sad, existing happy, existing drinking a beer, existing drinking an energy drink, existing eating the delicious cheesecake cupcakes I made earlier today. Could be a whole bunch of other ways of existing. Usually I prefer it to be the existing of eating cheesecake cupcakes, the delicious. First time I make cheesecake, by the way, it was great. And so existing is not like a terminal motion. And what I mean by that is, like, so I have a ball, and so the analogy with inertia, hold on 1 second here. The analogy with inertia is like, once you throw a thing, it has a tendency to continue in motion. And here I have Catboy. And as I'm sure you're well aware, he has super cat speed. And when he engages his super cat speed, I can throw it up in the air, and for the most part, he's going to, keep moving until the force of gravity, moving upwards until the force of gravity pulls him back down. And now, the motion that he has is, or the continued motion that now he's gone. I don't want to be there. It's too late anyway. The motion that he has after I've thrown him is something that is intrinsic to him as a material thing. And so as a material thing, it is something that is in its nature in motion. And there's a kind of a material cause that's happening there too. So the Catboy is prior to Catboy's motion, right?
Right.
Cap is prior to Catboy's motion. And so when I throw Catboy, there is still something for that motion to continue to subsist in, that the motion itself presupposes. Essay, on the other hand, it's the other way around. Essay presupposes the substance or the essence presupposes the essay. Catboy's prior to Catboy's motion. Right? I said that right. Yeah.
Yes.
Catboy is prior to Catboy's motion. And so when I throw Catboy, there's still some degree of receptivity to motion that is already proper to Catboy, and generation of motion as well. Catboy as a material thing is going to be in motion to some extent by its very nature. And now, when I throw Catboy, if I were in a perfect vacuum here, that acceleration of 60 miles per hour, because he is using his supercat speed as we previously did, it's going to remain at 60%. Great. And so it remains at this flat level. So it's at 60 miles per hour. Great. Love it. Cool. Great. He's moving really fast because he's Catboy employing supercat speed. Essay, on the other hand, isn't just reaching a terminal velocity, but rather Essay is this. So Catboy. So Catboy, if physical inertia is like the having been thrown, then we're actually at the wrong analogy for existing, or for essay. Mm-hmm. Because essay is something that's continuous and progressive. It's dynamic. It's something that kind of changes in character. If you look in St. Thomas's philosophy, this is something called virtual quantity. So a thing. So when you have a substance, when you have a man, you can have a man who is better at being a man than other men, because he instantiates what it means to be a human in a way that's greater, and so he exists as a human in a greater degree, but he's still flatly a human. And so when it comes to him being human, it is this flat. He's a human. We're recognizing that humans are a particular nature, particular definition, and so on and so forth. But existing, on the other hand, and so that's within the entitative categories. That's a categorical. That's a categorical definition or categorical form. Mm-hmm. But essay is actually something that's pre-categorical, and so it's not going to have that flat character. It's not going to have that just facticity character. It's something that's going to be dynamic, be changing, it's going to be in motion. It's going to be active in some sense. And so when you have a human, that human is not just there being a human and having no other qualities or additions or perfections added to it. Rather, it's going to be a continual growth and progress through time and through change. All these various, these things he accumulates to himself, either to perfect himself or to actually decrease in his own perfection. And so essay is actually more like, if you think about it, and even the word itself, essay, it's the existing. And St. Thomas compares essay to running, or the essay of a man to a man running. It's a progressive thing, and so it's more like the accelerating. Essay is the accelerating of the substance towards its perfection, right. And so there's a continual progress. And so with inertial motion, you throw the thing, and then by its nature as a mobile thing, it's going to continue to move on. If you even just consider it to be existing in a vacuum. Conversely, or on the other hand, essay is a continual accelerating of a thing's existence towards a greater, or decelerating towards a lesser degree of its perfections. And so you have its essay as something that's a continual generating principle in it that is prior to it and is outside of its own nature in terms of what it can do. And so just as Catboy isn't going, this Catboy here, he's not going to start flying by himself. In order for him to, but he will fly a little bit because of inertia. He's not going to accelerate himself to go faster, right. Because he's not the real Catboy. Sorry to break it to all of you.
It's quite tragic.
And so, in the same way, because every finite thing, considered precisely in itself, is nothing. Even if it comes into existence, the way that it comes into existence is not something that it can do, nor is it something that it itself can continue to do because of its finite nature. It cannot effect existence simpliciter within itself. So it's this continual unfolding of perfection that you find in a thing in motion. And that's one of the reasons why you can't have the same existential inertia, because the substance in motion continually relies on its essay and relies on the thing causing the essay in it in order for it to exist and have any other perfection whatsoever, including the perfection of motion or the accident of motion.
Well, yeah, those are two very like philosophically bound objections. A very important. The existential inertia obviously is a very hot topic in the literature, and it's true. Like a lot of times, you'll see like people like Father William Wallace. He's very Aristotelian minded, and the way he kind of objects to it is different than that. Though that's actually, I definitely would agree. It's more like acceleration, or like the act of running makes a lot of sense, because act of running is something you have to continuously do, right? You have to continue, and existence isn't really like just, like you said, like floating in space, or as it were, or being the effect of one action. Since at least this seems like the core claim to me of Thomism is that that existence is a type of action, something that needs to be actualized every moment, right, in order to be. Otherwise you would disappear, right? That's why God needs to be the sustainer of the universe, rather than just like some kind of deistic put it in motion at one point to maintain all motion in the universe, which includes existence, since that's a type of motion. Anyway, well, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. If you wanted to, anybody who's interested in Thomism, how would you recommend to them to get started? Like, what kind of books would you recommend to them to start reading?
So I would recommend reading St. Thomas himself for yourself, and I wouldn't recommend the Summa though, because it is just like way too gigantic. What I would recommend is a little known work called the Compendium of Theology, which is sort of this brief approach or brief summary of the Summa Theologiae. And so I would read, Summa. Yeah, Summa of the Summa, yeah, exactly. I would read that, and then after you've read that, I would then turn to somebody like Joseph Owen. So I would Joseph Owen's currently the best. If you want to get into metaphysics, which I think, unless you understand St. Thomas' metaphysics, you don't really understand St. Thomas. So metaphysics is super important. Hence, I would recommend Joseph Owen's Elementary Christian Metaphysics. There we go, an Elementary Christian Metaphysics, which takes slowly. It's not actually elementary, but it's going to give you a really, really good introduction and give you a lot of the different principles and notions you need in order to express Thomism in a more powerful sense. So there's that. I would also recommend Faith's books. Aquinas, Last Superstition was good. It's obviously a bit more polemical. Otherwise, I think.
Do you feel like the Manualist is a good place to start? Like somebody like Lagrange, rather.
Yeah, Garrigou Lagrange is really good too. I really like him. And he is much more existentialist than I think that people will attribute to him.
Quite.
I would recommend. Who would I not recommend? Or who would I recommend? Etienne Gilson is really good. How am I not thinking this? W. Norris Clark has a couple of great books out there. Probably W. Norris Clark. One in the Many, and then another one's called Person and Being. Those are two books I'd really recommend. In fact, I'd say read those before you read through Owens, because it'll acclimate your mind a little better to what St. Thomas is, or how the Thomistic tradition is developed and whatnot. So
awesome. Well, again, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. We're going to put your links in the description so people can find you. Is there anywhere else that you would ask people to go to so that they can support you, or read any more of your work?
Joking. I don't have a Patreon. No, I don't really have a whole lot of work out there right now. It's been not a good year for practice necessarily. Transitioning to homeschool, having to work 2 or 3 jobs, whatnot, because of various things. I've had a hard time actually producing anything, but I do have some things up on academia. I have a couple of YouTube lectures that I gave for my class of Holy Apostles. You guys can check that out, where I do a more concise and probably more organized presentation of the first, second, and third to fourth ways. I don't have my fifth way lecture up right now. And if you want to check those out, those would be probably some of the best resources for me. Otherwise, you can always hit me up on Facebook. I'm always good to chat.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming, and thank you all for watching. I hope that you guys enjoyed this discussion of the argument for motion. It's been a pleasure. Have a nice day.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.